gallant little brother here in the church, and he was a soldier, got pulled all to pieces in the army, almost laid out for dead, and said that the medics didn't think he'd live, and wasn't even worth fooling with. He was so far gone, the main nerves in his leg bursted, his little arm almost broke completely off his leg, one leg off nearly. But God, seeing grace, saved him and healed him one day. He was Brother Roy Roberson's present when that picture was taken there at Houston.
I'm Brother Roberson. I'd like to take a few minutes to relate to you some of the great miracles that I was privileged to see during the years I was with Brother Branham from 1949 to 1964. The first time that I met Brother Branham to speak to him was in Houston, Texas in 1950. And that was in one of his great healing campaigns. And that was where the angel of the Lord picture was made in that meeting. And it was a great privilege for me. I had never seen anything like it. It was a great prophet, a man of God that I looked at. And that first night that we was there in the meeting, the wife and I, my wife was the third one in the prayer line. And as she walked up to where Brother Branham was in the prayer line up to him, he looked at her, and he had a way about him that nobody else had. And he said, "Oh, sister, I see that you live in 7 miles of where I do. You live in New Albany, Indiana." And he said, "You and your husband has driven all the way down here and to get here being this first night of the service." And he says, "I could tell you a lot of things, sister." He says, "I see you when you got to your motel here in Houston this afternoon that you were standing looking out the window, and you was talking to your husband, and you said, 'Well, we should hurry up or I won't be able to get in that prayer line.'" And I marveled at when I heard this. I looked at him, I said, "What is this man?" He knew the secrets of the heart. And then he went ahead to tell her, he said, "I could tell you lots of things, sister, because I see you from the time you were just a small girl up through your life." And then that went on to be one of the greatest meetings that Brother Branham said he believed that he ever had, because there was great miracles happened in the mass prayer that he would have for the congregation, which was about 10,000 in that Coliseum. We were standing in the back one evening, it's just before the dismissal prayer, and when he had this massive prayer, why, there was people healed all over the building, and then standing close to us was a Spanish brother with a little child about 3 years old, and was blind. And we were, 50 feet to 100 feet away from the platform where Brother Branham was, or maybe farther. And during that prayer, that baby was healed. Its eyes came open. And that was one of the greatest things that for me to see, because I had my family and my background had been Methodist. And so after we came back from that meeting, why, I went to the church on a Sunday morning, and Brother Branham, I was sitting in the back room, and he would come in there, and we'd have prayer before church, as Brother Grim Snellings and some of the deacons. And I had been to the church 9 months before that, but I never got to talk to Brother Branham. He walked over to me and he said, "Oh, you're Brother Roberson. You was down to that meeting in Houston?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, why didn't you tell me that you was short of money, that you needed a little money to get back on?" And I didn't know what to say, because I didn't want him to know that. We had to come back about 2 nights earlier because we had run short of our money. And that was just something that I couldn't understand at first. He knew the secrets of your heart. So I would ask some of the ministers around. They would be confused about that. I said, "Well, I'd like to know, this man, Brother Branham, is different to anybody else." And they would say, "Oh, now you don't want to get mixed up in that." I said, "Yes, but you didn't tell me anything like that." So from that time on, I lived in Clarksville, Indiana, and I came well acquainted with Brother Branham. I had been in the service, and he's talking about going hunting, and he'd asked me about some of the rifles and the guns, and so him and Sister Branham came to eat with us several times, and we just become great friends from that on. And 1953, he asked me if I would be a trustee on his board of the church, at the church there. And I still am. That's been since 1953. And I went through some great times with hunting trips, and then in the great campaigns he had that I was able to be to. And he was a peculiar man. There was no one that I'd ever come in contact. I had been in service, and I talked to generals and all kinds of people, but this man, there was something different about him. To know Brother Branham was to love him. And he had a personality that he was just so kind and sweet. And there never was anything that came up in your life, any troubles or trials. But what if you go to him, he had some way that he would be able to help you. And one thing I remember outstanding was that in 1951, during the Korean War, we lost our youngest son. And he was just 21 years old, and he'd been married about a year, and they had a little 6-week-old baby. Well, that was very hard to understand for my wife and I, because we couldn't understand why would the Lord take a young man and leaving a wife and baby, and maybe, you know how you think that why he wouldn't take one of us. So Brother Branham attended the funeral, and it was down here in Kentucky, Hopkinsville, Kentucky. And he prayed. The chaplain had the funeral, and he prayed at the funeral home and at the gravesite. And it was a military funeral, and he made himself acquainted with all the military men and talked to them and shook hands with them. He had a way to greet people, and he could just talk to anyone. But then he told me a few weeks after that, we were going hunting out to Brother George Wright's. He lives out here in the country about 3 miles on a farm, he did, and Brother Branham was really loved the family, and we would go out there quite often and just to be fellowship with them and to eat with them, and we'd go rabbit hunting and talk to the Brother and Sister Wright and Brother Shelby, which I know you've heard of him mention their names. But on the way out there, while we was riding along, and he asked me, he said, Brother Roberson, there's something I feel I should tell you. He said, you've been worried about your son Eddie that got killed. He said, you was wondering whether or not he was saved. And I said, yes, Brother Branham, I just worried about it. I was thinking that right then, but I just hated to bother him or ask him anything. And he said, what I want to tell you is, he said, you're worried and you're causing yourself to have an ulcer. You said, you're a nervous type person like I am. And he said, another thing I want to tell you, Brother Roy, he said, I see you when you're laying on a stretcher over there in France in 1944 when you were wounded. He said you were severely wounded in your right arm and both legs, and the nerves were severed in your legs, and your right arm was just hanging. He said they laid you out on a stretcher there with another soldier, and he said they thought you were just dying. But he says the Lord had something for you to do later. And then when he said that, my mind flashed back to the time it happened, and I was never unconscious, but I didn't know whether or not I would live because I was bleeding bad. And during that time I was laying there, there was a Jeep drove up with a chaplain in it, and he had a driver with him, and they had the flag on the Jeep with the cross to show that they were chaplains. And he came over to me. He was a small man, and it was a captain. He had captain bars on. And he knelt down to me, and he said, soldier, are you a Protestant, or what are you? I said, well, I'm a Protestant. In fact, I wasn't anything. I hadn't been saved. I didn't know the Lord yet. But I was praying real hard right then. And he said, this chaplain said the Lord's Prayer over me, and took hold of my hand when he said it. And then he went to my buddy was on the other side of me, and he was a Catholic boy, and he said a prayer for him. And I had never said anything about this to my wife or anybody, but that prayer always would be in my mind. And I had promised the Lord, I said, Lord, if you'll spare my life, I'll live for you. So when I was discharged, I wasn't discharged till 1946. I was in the VA hospitals for about 2 years. Well, I remembered that promise, that I'd promised the Lord I'd serve him. So I told my wife one night, I think it was on a Sunday night, I said, we have to get out and find us a church to go to and serve the Lord. So I drove around, and at that time we was living in New Albany, Indiana. We drove around to several churches, but didn't seem to, didn't get out and go in. We just drove in, so we wound up at the Branham Tabernacle. And we walked in there, and we sat down in the back seat because I hadn't been in church for years. And the Lord had just led us there. And that was, from that time on, I went there and still go there. But I hadn't met Brother Branham then until I met him in Houston, Texas. But then another thing that comes in my mind is we lived up here. We built a new home. That was in 1951 also, up on above Jeffersonville on the State Road 62. And it's right out of the suburbs of Jeffersonville. And at that time there wasn't any city water up through there. So I had a well drilled, and the driller must have drilled it too deep or something, and we didn't know anything about it till the plumber had hooked it up and had it hooked up into all the pipes in the house and everything, and we turned the water on. It was just pure salt water. And it was really, something. We just built the home, took about all we had to do it, and to have that salt water, we couldn't use it at all. So I told Brother Brown about it down to church, and he said, well, Brother Roberson, we just have to ask the Lord and pray about it. So he said, I'll be up there. It was on Sunday morning. I'll be up there this afternoon and visit with you. So on that Sunday afternoon, him and Sister Branham came to the house, and he went out in the kitchen and turned the water on. He said, let me taste this water. I said, maybe it's sulfur water. And he took a swallow of it, and he said, oh, my, it's salt. So he had to spit it out. It was just so strong. And he said, we visited with us a while, and he said, well, we'll pray about this, Brother Roberson. And when he left, that's all he had said. So I didn't know what to think about the water or anything. And about 3 weeks later, he had a healing service in Connersville, Indiana. And my wife and I and Brother Brown's mother and one of his brothers, Donnie, we rode up to Connersville. It was in May in warm weather, and the meeting was out in the big ballpark up there, football stadium like, and they was in the bleachers. We were sitting back in the bleachers. We were about, I'd say, almost 100 yards from where the platform was. And during this service, he pointed his hand out to where we were sitting, and he said, Sister Roberson, he says, I see a light hanging over your head. That's that angel of the Lord. He said, you worrying about that water down there in Jeffersonville and that well. He said, you just quit worrying about that water. He said, it'll be all right. So, sure enough, from that time till this, the water was just as pure, and there's a neighbor that lives next door to this house that's still there, and they are a witness of that there. You could go to their house, they would tell you about it, because they lived next door to it, and their water was a little salty, but nothing like that. But that was another thing where Elijah purified the water. I mean, all this comes back to what the man of God had come in this generation, and a prophet of God, like unto Moses, that knew the secrets of people's heart and could tell you for any need there was. And then you could be fellowship with him and go out, and it would just be a ordinary, you'd think, ordinary man, but he wasn't. At all times, this angel of the Lord was with him, because you could feel the presence. And I know when I was sleeping one night, we was hunting, and he slept in my camper quite a bit. And one night in the night, sometime I woke up and I slept on one side and him on the other. And he said, "Are you awake, Brother Roberson?" I said, "Yeah." I woke up all of a sudden, and I could feel a power. There was a powerful light shining in there, and I just felt like I was going to raise up and leave that place. I didn't know what to think. He said, "Well, I just wanted to check." Said, "You've been sleeping awful sound and easy," but he says, "The angel of the Lord has visited us." And then I knew what it was. I had the angel of the Lord was Brother Branham was having a vision, or he was in there talking to. But then later, at Sunset Mountain, he had told us to go take our wife and go out there and just spend some time in fellowship. He says that's a great place to be, Brother Roy. He said the angel of the Lord will be there, and it's a spiritual place. He said, said, you and Sister Roberson just go out there and stay some night. So we went out there one little time later, and we were living in Tucson at that time. And that night after we got there, why, I had built up a fire around this rock that's right close there where the picture of the angel of the Lord was on there, where Brother Branham was standing with Brother Joseph. And I made that picture, but this was sometime after that. So after it got dark, well, I began, there was hunters coming, going up and down the road in the back of some Jeeps, and I got to thinking, well, maybe they might come there and just take our camper and do away with us or something, because that did happen in Mexico and around our coast. So I had my wife to get in the camper, and we locked the door, and I started to pray, praying and asked the Lord to be with us. And that same spirit come in that truck again in that camper, and it was just a wonderful experience. It's like the Holy Ghost was in there, and a voice was speaking to me and said, fear not, haven't you seen the glory of God happen right here at this place? And went ahead to tell me of different things I shouldn't do. And one thing especially said have nothing to do with politics. And it was a great experience. And I told my wife about it. She didn't feel the same spirit that I did. She didn't feel like I did. But anyway, she said she knew something was going on because it was a great feeling. And Brother Branham, I met him a day or two after that. We was all living there in Tucson at that time. And I said, Brother Branham, I went out to Sunset like you said to go, and I said, I had an experience out there. I said, I got frightened about just a wife and I there, and there's so many hunters going up and down that road behind us that I got afraid they might come back there and just take our camp or something. I said, I got inside and started praying, and I told him exactly what the voice had said to me. And he said, well, Brother Roberson, what that was, he said, it's that same angel that's in that picture that you see on that rock. He said, that angel came down there and stayed with you. Well, the angel on that rock, you can see on the picture who it was. But he said, whenever you started praying, you contact that angel. And no matter where you're at, many times I felt that angel by me, and I know one time as an experience that I felt Brother Branham's presence with me. I was in a restaurant in Tucson, and these things happen in our lifetime where we had become a lot of my friends and ones that I'd fellowship with. Where these little things would come up and seem like this special time they walked by where we were sitting at our table, and they didn't stop and speak and fellowship with us. And it hurt me real bad, and I just thought to myself, well, I don't believe Brother Branham would ever walk by here and not have stopped and said something. And once I could just feel, I could see him and I could feel him. He walked up and sat down there with me. Well, that was that angel that is with you, and if you pray and contact that angel, he'll come to you in sickness or whatever it might be. And it's another time that Sister Branham was with us, with my wife and I, and we were at a Furs restaurant, another place out there. And we were sitting talking about Brother Branham and just fellowshipping, and all at once to become real quiet. And I could feel the presence of the Lord, of the angel. And Sister Branham, I said, can you feel that? And she said, yes. Says, he's here now, Brother Roberson. So that's the experiences we can have today if we'll just believe in what this prophet, or what this man of God told us. And if we listen to those tapes, that any time we're in need, if we ask, we'll get what we have if we have that faith and believe it. And then I'd like to tell about this vision that I had. I had some visions that happened during the years I knew Brother Branham, and on the hunting trips a lot of times that things would happen that he would tell us that was going to happen before it did. But this was a vision that I had. The Lord woke me up one night. It was in 1963. I think it was long in March, 1st of March. I was here in Jeffersonville, and Brother Banks Woods and I were remodeling the church down here to make it larger. And we'd worked on it all winter, and it was a cold winter, and we're just trying to get it finished up because Brother Branham was coming back in around the 1st of March or sometime last of March anyway, to preach the 7 seals. And we were in a hurry and trying to get it straightened up. The parking lots was all muddy, and we had to get that straightened out and dried out and put just crushed rock on it. And one morning before I went to work, it was early in the morning, about 4 o'clock, I woke up and my room was just lit up. And I was sitting at a large table with Brother Branham. Brother Branham said it was a table like a Lord's Supper table. And I was sitting on the east side of it. He was sitting right across, like to be on the west. It was a large table, looked like it would seat about 25 or 30 people. And it was sitting in a narrow street, like in the Oriental country, in a narrow street like they have, and the sidewalks were just right back of where the chairs were on each side of the table. And I was sitting talking to Brother Branham about something about the church and the board or something like we usually talk about. And all at once I heard this like a whirlwind, and I looked up, and here was that amber-colored cloud. It come right down over Brother Branham and took him, it just lifted him up, and he went right in that cloud. And he went right into the sky and out of my sight. Well, I was real frightened. So I started to say, where in the world am I at here? And nobody, Brother Branham's gone. People were walking back of me and around, and they had turbans on their head. They was speaking another language, and they wouldn't even listen to me. It didn't sound like they heard me. I said, Brother Branham, come back. Brother Branham, come back. And all of a sudden, I hear this shrill wind again, and I looked up, and the cloud was coming back, and it was a terrific sound, and it come to the head of the table, there was a large chair at each end of the table, and it just went right, he sat right down in that chair, and all I could see of Brother Branham was from his, just around his waist up, and it wasn't the Brother Branham that I seen in the chair where he left. I could just see his face, and it was a bright, a terrific brightness and that amber color. And I says, Brother Branham, I sure don't understand this. And he spoke with a loud voice. And he said, Brother Roy, you wouldn't understand it, because he said, you're just like Simon. And it sounded like a loudspeaker. He spoke so loud. And then the vision left me. Well, it frightened me, to know what it meant, because I knew I'd never know without he told me. So I called and told him about it, and I was in Jeffersonville and he was in Tucson. And just before he came back to preach the 7 seals. And he says, well, Brother Roberson, that was sent of you of the Lord. And he says, you hold your peace and I will reveal it when the time comes. So that didn't leave me. That when I seen that face, see his face in that amber cloud, it just stayed right with me. So it wasn't long, it wasn't but just a few days till he came back, and he came back with Brother Gene Norman and Brother Fred Softman. And I stand at the back of the Branham Tabernacle down here, and I was raking the crushed rock around the back door. And Brother Branham came over to started over where I was, and Brother Fred and Brother Norman went in the side door. Well, as he got up close to me, that his face was so bright and shiny that I had to turn my head, and I couldn't look at him because he was looking at me. So he laid his hand on my shoulder, and he said, Brother Roberson, I'll talk to you later. And that was a great change in my life when I looked at him when he walked up to me. That I don't know, I know other people have seen it, but he went home that night. I didn't know this till later, and he told Sister Branham, he said, Brother Roberson has seen something today. I think he understands now. Well, there's no way for me to explain, but after that was after the angels had met him, and he was commissioned to come back here and preach the 7 seals. I think that after that, everything was different. But then he tells that on Standing in the Gap. He tells that there vision, And the time that Brother Fred and them, we were on a hunting trip up in British Columbia, and we're coming back. And he asked me about that, and then he talked about it. He told me to tell Brother Fred and Brother Welch Evans, when I got a chance, that vision, and that was the only two I was supposed to tell it, that he would reveal it. And he tells about it on different tapes. And then one more thing that the Lord gave me a vision of was, I was living in Tucson at that time, as 1964. I just moved out there in May, and this was later on in that year that Brother Branham would come back to Jeff during the summertime. He didn't stay in Arizona. He always liked to come back here in Viswal, and then he would come back. And I had just got there, and when he started getting ready to come back, I was real homesick to come too. He said it's been a good time to come in October, Brother Roberson. He said it get hot out here. And so I was real disgusted. And he said, Brother Roberson, you come out and stand in the backyard. He said, you live here in this apartment where I am and take care of these guns and things I've got here while I'm gone, you and Sister Roberson. But he said, you walk out in that backyard and look up there on that Finger Rock Mountain where Finger Rock is. And he said, you just imagine that you see Moses walking up that mountaintop, along that mountaintop. And he said, that'll make you feel better. I said, okay, Brother Branham, I'll do that. So after he left, the Lord come to me in a vision, and he showed me Brother Branham standing on this mountain in a canyon right in the back of where his house is out there. There's a large canyon, and it's right down from that Finger Rock, what they call Finger Rock, on the top of the mountain. And he was standing about halfway up to that rock in the middle of that canyon in this vision, and this amber cloud was over his head. And it was just raising and lowering up over his head. And I was standing in front of him, and it seemed like 100 yards or so. I could see him real plain. And there was a Brother Welch Evans on my right, and Brother Softman was on my left. And we were looking at him, and there was a voice come out of this cloud, a real loud, clear voice, says, this is my prophet. And as Moses was called to lead the children of Israel, so is this my prophet will lead this generation with a pillar of fire. And then the vision just faded away, but these brothers started shouting and enjoying it, and said, I told you so, I told you so. So again, I called Brother Branham. He was back here in Jeffersonville, and told him, and he said, Brother Roberson, that's another vision that the Lord has sent you. And he says, you don't tell anybody, because I'll tell it when the time comes. And then that was such a great thing. He mentions that on Standing in the Gap, I believe, where it was referred to him as Moses. And he says, Brother Roberson, do you know who Moses was? I said, no, I don't. He said, well, he was God to those children of Israel. And he said he could speak into existence fleas and all kinds of, he said, like squirrels. And when he said squirrels, then it come to me that he was the same as Moses. He was God to this people of this generation, and the same as Moses was to those children of Israel. He was to lead us in this generation. And it is the same thing. He says that you could go out there, and those places are special places. You go to Sunset Mountain, there's a rock. And he said, Brother Roberson, that's the same rock that Moses stood by. That's where the whirlwind came down, and then right close back over the mountain was where the angel of the Lord appeared to him. And the Catalina Mountains are the same way. He said Moses would walk the top of that mountain around there. He was just like in Jerusalem. It's the same thing as what Moses did, is what Brother Branham did. He was God to this generation. And it'll go back, and it'll be the same holy mountains. He called it a holy mountain. The same thing as they went through the wilderness. And when he said that was that same rock, you know, a lot of people would deny it. I didn't. I said, well, I am not going to question. If he said it was, I say it is the same rock. And somebody said, how did it get there? Well, he said during the flood of that time, that desert was all the water was over that and everything was changed. So how it got there or anything else, it was there. And I firmly believe this because down in my heart, I know that there was God to those people. Because if he could see me laying on a stretcher in 1944 over there in France, and I was a sinner, and he could tell me where I was hurt, and what was exactly what the doctors diagnosed what was wrong with me, he said, you had something to do later on, Brother Roberson, and the Lord let you come back to do something. And then I had a dream right after I met Brother Branham. It was a dream, something like. And in this dream, it was like in a park where they have these little walk bridges that goes up over a stream of water. And my wife was with me, and we was walking in this park. And as we come up this bridge, we were really despondent, and we feel like we are today. And we was looking for something. We didn't know what to do, and was down and looked across that bridge, and there stood Brother Branham. Only he was young, and he had a lot of hair. And in his younger days, he had a lot of hair. All the Branhams had that heavy hair, and he was smiling at us. And as we walked over to him, he greeted us. Well, that dream I just had, I never did tell him about it. I never did think any more about it. So about 10 years later, we was at Sunset Mountain this time, and we'd been a-hunting, all of us, and we'd go out on a jeep, and different ones would get off at different places, and we'd hunt separately, and then pick each one up as we came back. On the way back, I was driving Brother Gene Norman's jeep, and it was Brother Fred and Brother Welch and some more of the brothers. And just before we got to the camp, he said, Brother Roberson, I re-seen a dream that you had a long time ago. And he said, you won't understand it till I mention one thing. And he said, now, I'll tell you about that one of these days. So I kept wondering each time I'd see him, I'd think, when's he going to tell me about that dream? So we sitting in First Cafeteria one time, and just the wife and I, and Brother and Sister Branham and Brother Joseph was small, and they were in that cafeteria too. And as they finished eating before we did, and they come by, and he stopped, he said, Brother, I want to tell you about that dream. While Sister Roberson's here with you, he said, now you won't remember till I say one thing. He said, you was walking in a kind of a park-like place where there was a lot of trees and streams of water, and there was a bridge over this stream of water, a walk bridge-like. I still didn't remember it. And he said, you looked up, and you see me standing on the other side, and he said I was young and I had a lot of hair on my head. He said, do you remember it now, Brother Roberson? And when he mentioned the hair and young, I said, well, yes, I remember that. But he said, he told me, he said, you wouldn't remember it till I mentioned the hair. But he said, don't worry, everything's all right. And then we lived in a trailer in Tucson down along next to the freeway for a couple of years. And one night the Lord came to me and woke me up, and I was walking down the blacktop road right outside. It seemed like right outside that trailer there was a blacktop road went down towards the freeway. And in the vision, a bright light shined down over my head, right on the side of the road in the ditch like. And laying in the ditch where the light was shining, there was a face. And it was just the nose and the eyes and the hair. And I couldn't explain what it looked like. I didn't know what it was. And this light went from me, it shined on me, while it went over to that face right in the right of the road. And I was just wondering what it was, and Brother Branham appeared in the vision right beside of me. And again I said, well, sure, I don't understand but this, Brother Branham. He said, well, don't worry, I'm with you. And then I went by his house. It kept one Saturday, he's washing his car, and I thought, well, I won't bother him, so I drove up the street and I come back by, and he said, now, if anytime you want to stop, Brother Rubin, he said, stop and tell me anything. So it was on my mind, I just stopped and I went in, And Sister Branham would be on, she was in the one side of the apartment where they had their kitchen and everything, and Brother Branham had to use the other side. It was a duplex-like where he studied. Well, my wife went in where Sister Branham was, and I walked in. Brother Branham was cleaning his rifles, and I walked up to him, and he said, "Well, hello, Brother Roberson." I said, "Brother Branham, and as I said that, he says, "I know why you're here." He said, "You had a dream, didn't you?" Now, he said, "I can tell you right now what it was." But he said, "When you leave," he said, you and your wife, he said, "you go home." And that was on Saturday. He said, "I'll come down there tomorrow." It's on a Sunday, and I'll tell you your dream, but I want you to go home, take your wife and go home. And I'll come to your house. So, next day, I waited all on Sunday morning, and of course we kept waiting around about, I think it was a little after noontime, why Brother Bam came in his station wagon. He pulled up and stopped, and he come in, and he had a large envelope under his arm, a brown envelope. And he talked, like he used to did, a lot of things, and this fellowship, and there he said, "Well, I've come to accomplish this." He said, let me see how he said that. "Fulfill what I told you." He said, "I've come to fulfill that, take that vision." He said, "What you seen, Brother Roberson, on that face along the road," he said, "that's that picture of the Lord Jesus." He said, "You've got it hanging there on your wall, and you've got it hanging the wrong way." He said, "You turn that up, and you'll see that white cloud over him is supreme authority." He said, "If you remember in the attorney's office, they had those white wigs that they wore. But he said, that means supreme authority." He said, "That was the Lord Jesus Christ." He said, "You see his eyes and his mouth." He said, "What you have, you got your picture turned the wrong way. I didn't have it turned up right." And he said, again, he said, "Don't worry about it, Brother Roberson. I was there with you." But that was something great. And then there's I'll go from one to another. I may not get them just one right the way they came, but after the accident happened, why, Brother Billy had called me and told me what happened, and I called all the other brothers. Brother Billy had called me and told me what happened, and I called all the other brothers. And they had gone to Amarillo, and I was just in a bad state. I couldn't pray or couldn't even talk or nothing. And I didn't get to leave right away to come to Amarillo. But anyway, my wife was working at nighttime, and I was there in a trailer alone. And, we just couldn't understand anything. So I couldn't pray, and I was laying there. And all at once, the room I was in lit up, and Brother Branham walked up to the side of my bed, and he had on his hat, and his Bible was under his arm. And he reached down, got a hold of my hand, and he said, "Don't worry about it, Brother Roberson." He said, "I'll meet you at Mount Zion." Well, then I come to myself. I know, it was for a reason. I thought, he said, "Don't worry about it. I'll meet you at Mount Zion." And then it just faded away, but just as plain as I had ever seen him. He walked right up to the side of my bed and reached down and got a hold of my hand. And that has been something to think about when I get down and out and, discouraged. I think, maybe I'll have a chance after all. But then I can go back to many things that happened when we were hunting. One time when we were going to antelope hunting, was going out through Kansas, going to Wyoming, and we was driving his little Chevrolet truck, and he said, "I think it's a long ways out there. Those days the service stations was far apart, and it would be maybe miles you'd drive." He said, "We had better stop at this next filling station and fill up with gas." And he said, "The Lord wants me to stop there," or something like that. And I never thought. Brother Woods and I was with him, and we pulled up to this little station. It was way out the people lived in the back and just had these 2 gas pumps out front. So on his little truck, it was a little carry-all truck he had on there, William Branham campaigns, and they said, "I will come again." But when the fellow was filling the tank up, why, this lady come out, and she said, looked around, she said, "Are you Brother Branham?" And he just had his hunting clothes on. He said, "Yes, ma'am, I'm Brother Branham." She said, "I was in one of your meetings in such and such a place, I forget." She said, "You know, we've got a little daughter back here that's real sick." And said, "The Lord just," said, "I had a dream that you would come." Said, "Would you come in and pray with her?" He said, "Why, sister, I sure will." He said, told Brother Woods and he said, "Now you brothers stay out here with the truck, and I'll go in and pray for the little girl." Well, that was unusual, because usually he'd ask us to go in with him. And he was gone about 15 or 20 minutes, and he came back out. He said, "Well, you know, the Lord's good." He said, "I went in, and the Lord showed me a vision, and the little child was healed. But the Lord, see, had told him to stop there to get that gas." And then in another thing was real good, I think, was there was a lady come to the church down here all the time. She'd be in all the meetings, and I might not call her name, but she had a habit that she's trying to quit smoking cigarettes. And she had tried, and she'd prayed and everything, and it's just hard for her to give it up. But sometime after it'd been quite a while that she'd trying to get rid of the cigarettes, why, she got sick and was in the hospital in New Albany, and the doctors examined her, and she had cancer in both lungs. And they just sent her home, and there wasn't anything they could do. And they lived out of New Albany up on what you call the knobs up in there, and we used to go up in there to target our guns in before we'd go hunting. We didn't have any shooting range. And they lived up there in a log house. So she had called my wife, and I said, "Well, I hate to ask Brother Branham about anything like that when we're going to hunting, because I don't like to bother him." So I knew that he knew her husband real well, and she went to the church. So I said, "Brother Branham, do you know Sister so-and-so?" I said, "She asked if you would come pray for her sometime." He said, "Oh, I tell you, Brother Roberson, if you want to, we'll just stop by there as we go home after we get our guns targeted in." So we had been out real early, and this was about 10 o'clock. We started home. He said, "Well, we'll go by Sister Walton's house." We got inside the house, and her husband was sitting there, and she had her robe on. She was able to sit up in a chair. And he said, "Well, sister, we come by. We've been targeting our guns in, and thought we'd stop by and pray for you." Well, she said, "Brother Branham, I had a dream about you coming." He said, "I know you did." And he said, "Brother Roberson, you sit over there on that divan, and Brother Wood, you sit here in the chair, this other chair." And he said, "Now, sister, I'm going to pray for you." And he took hold of her hand. And but at one time, when he take hold of your hand, there would be a spot come up on his hand. It was, I don't know what it was really, because I never had seen it till this time. And he could tell what was wrong with you. But that was one of the first signs he had. And he said, "Come here, Brother Roberson, Brother Wood, I want to show you this." So we looked on his hand, and he knew. He said, "Well, sister, you've got cancer in both lungs." And he said, "The doctors have sent you home to die." And he said, "Now, if the Lord doesn't take this away when I pray for you," he said, you will die." So he took over her hand and he prayed, and when he stopped praying, he looked and he said, "Well, it's still there." So he said, "Well, I tell you what," said, "Brother Roberson, you change seats where you're sitting with Brother Woods, and you sit in his seat, and you go over there, Brother Woods, sit where Brother Roberson was." And he said to this lady's husband, he said, "And I see you," he said, "you've got Bright's disease, and you're sick with you." And he said, "Sister, you and your husband's been a fussing before we got here this morning." He said, "Well, before we come in, wasn't you kind of fussing?" She said, "Oh, well, he calls me." He said, "No, don't try to lay it on him." he said, you repent and say that you're not going to do that anymore, because he said, this is serious. He says, I'm going to pray for you again, and if this doesn't leave, he said, you will die. But he made us change seats, and that's what and then he talked to them, and he prayed, and it left her hand. And she's living today. She lives in Florida, and she was completely healed of that, just well as could be. But that's something that had to be, some people didn't understand it, but the vision had to be just right. Everything had to be in place when he prayed for you. And those things was things that we shouldn't even question. But that's the only time I ever seen, I've heard him tell about that the hat had to be so in place. And I thank you for listening, and I appreciate the Lord let me live in the time that I could be with Brother Branham, man of God. And I believe sincerely he was God to us the same as Moses. And I thank you. Lord bless you.